Everyone knows how the Challenger mission started.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
But very few people know how it actually ended for the people inside. The official story often glosses over the minutes after the shuttle broke apart. Yeah, about that.
The first clue came when they cleared the sand, heat tiles, the same protective tiles that once covered the bottom of the country's space shuttles.
The evidence recovered from the ocean floor 5 weeks later changed everything. It proved that the crew was fighting to survive even after the vehicle was gone. We are going to look at what the divers found, why certain air packs were turned on, and why NASA chose to bury the cabin in a secret location at sea. The day the sky broke. The morning of January 28th, 1986, was unusually cold for Cape Canaveral, Florida. Temperatures had dropped to 36 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, which was well below the normal range for a shuttle launch. Ice formed on the launch pad. Engineers took photographs of icicles hanging from the shuttle's external tank. But the launch had already been delayed 6 times. There was political pressure to proceed. The mission was special. It would put the first civilian, a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe, into space as part of the Teacher in Space project. Students across America were gathered in classrooms to watch the launch live. The eyes of the nation were focused on this mission. The 7 crew members were people with families, dreams, and lives that extended far beyond this mission. Commander Francis Dick Scobie was a 46-year-old Air Force veteran. Pilot Michael Smith was a 40-year-old Navy aviator on his first mission. Judith Resnick was a 36-year-old electrical engineer. Ellison Onizuka was a 39-year-old Air Force lieutenant colonel and the first Asian American in space. Ronald McNair was a 35-year-old physicist and saxophonist. Gregory Jarvis was a 41-year-old engineer. And Krista McAuliffe was a 37-year-old high school teacher. Basically, they represented the best of us. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger lifted off from Launch Pad 39B. The massive solid rocket boosters ignited, producing the thrust needed to lift the 4.5 million pound shuttle stack off the ground. The ascent appeared normal. Families cheered. Teachers pointed at classroom televisions. Mission Control called out routine altitude and velocity milestones. Inside the crew cabin, the astronauts were experiencing the intense vibration and G-forces of launch. Everything was going according to plan. But then, things took a turn that no one expected. At 73 seconds into flight, the pilot said the words, "Uh-oh." 1 second later, at an altitude of 48,000 feet, the shuttle broke apart. But get this, it did not explode the way most people think. The large fireball that everyone saw was not the crew cabin. It was the external fuel tank rupturing, releasing thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen that ignited in the air. The shuttle itself, including the crew cabin, was torn apart by massive forces as the structure gave way. The 2 solid rocket boosters continued flying on their own until they were destroyed by remote command. And the crew cabin, the reinforced compartment where all 7 astronauts were strapped into their seats, broke away from the rest of the shuttle in one piece. This is the part that most people do not realize. The crew cabin did not vanish into thin air. It separated intact and continued its path. For 25 more seconds, the cabin continued upward, reaching a peak altitude of approximately 65,000 feet. Then, obeying the laws of physics, it began to fall. The cabin was not designed to survive a fall or a landing in the water. It was just the pressurized compartment where the crew sat. It had no independent engines, no parachutes, and no recovery system. It fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. At that altitude, the cabin was above most of the atmosphere. The astronauts would have felt weightless during the fall, the same feeling they had trained for. except this time they were falling toward the ocean. The cabin hit the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour. At that speed, water is as hard as concrete. Everything seemed fine until the moment the world realized that those 7 heroes were now on a path they could not escape. The truth about the final fall. In the immediate moments after the breakup, no one at Cape Canaveral or in Mission Control knew exactly what had happened. Telemetry data simply stopped. Visual tracking showed the shuttle breaking apart. But in those first seconds, there was confusion. Mission Control said they were looking very carefully at the situation, and that it was obviously a major malfunction. That phrase became something people would remember forever. It was the most restrained possible description of the tragedy. NASA's rules discouraged guessing until information could be confirmed. But within minutes, everyone knew the shuttle was gone, and the crew was lost. The immediate response shifted to search and rescue. Coast Guard helicopters were sent out. Navy vessels in the area moved toward where the debris fell. The hope was that somehow someone might have survived. But space shuttle crew cabins do not have seats that fly out. They do not have escape pods. Once the shuttle broke apart, at 48,000 feet, traveling at twice the speed of sound, there was no way to survive. By the end of the first day, the mission officially became a recovery effort. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida became the site of one of the largest recovery operations in history. The debris covered hundreds of square miles. Pieces of the shuttle were scattered across the ocean floor. NASA set up a systematic grid search. Coast Guard cutters, Navy ships, and specialized vessels worked through the area. Sonar equipment scanned the bottom of the sea. Divers went down in areas where they found big pieces. The mission had 2 goals. They wanted to find as much of the shuttle as possible to help the investigation, and they wanted to find the remains of the crew. The first priority was finding the crew cabin. It was the largest single piece, and it was where the astronauts had been. But the ocean is vast, and the cabin had fallen miles from the launch site. For weeks, the search continued. Hundreds of pieces of debris were found and taken to a secure hangar. Specialists began the slow process of putting the shuttle back together like a puzzle to understand what happened. Then on March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the disaster, sonar detected a large object on the ocean floor. It was about 18 miles northeast of the launch site in 100 feet of water. Divers were sent down to see what it was. What they found was the Challenger crew cabin. The cabin was badly damaged from the hit with the ocean, but they could tell what it was. The seats were still attached. The instrument panels were there. Inside the cabin were the remains of all 7 crew members. The recovery that followed was done with great care. This was not just about evidence. This was the recovery of American heroes. What most people do not realize is that the evidence found inside that cabin suggests those final minutes were far more active than the public was led to believe. Secrets of the ocean floor. NASA set up strict rules to handle the remains. They wanted to treat the crew with the most dignity possible. Information about the recovery was tightly controlled to protect the families. A secure area was set up around the site. Only certain people were allowed in. Press helicopters were kept away. The recovery teams worked quietly and methodically. The remains were brought to the surface and taken to a secure place. The families were told. This began one of the most difficult parts of the disaster. The identification of the crew took weeks and required a lot of sensitivity. In 1986,
DNA testing was not what it is today.
they had to use dental records and personal items to be sure. The condition of the remains showed the violence of the impact. The examination had two jobs. First, they had to identify everyone so they could go home to their families. Second, they had to figure out what happened in those final moments. This second part was painful, but necessary. NASA needed to know if the crew had survived the first breakup, if they were conscious, and if they had suffered. They wanted to learn lessons to make things safer for the next group of astronauts. The findings were very hard to hear. All 7 crew members passed away from the trauma of hitting the ocean. It was not survivable. But the question of what happened during the fall was the most haunting part. Were they aware? The evidence showed that at least some of them were. Investigators found that 3 of the 4 personal air packs had been turned on. These were emergency air supplies that the crew had to activate themselves. They did not turn on automatically. Someone had to reach up, unlock the device, and pull it down to get air. This means that after the breakup, at least 3 crew members were conscious enough to try and save themselves. These were not accidents. These were trained responses to an emergency. The air packs would not have saved them from the fall, but the fact they were on tells a big story. Some of the crew knew something was wrong, and they were trying to fight until the very end. How long were they conscious? The cabin likely lost pressure quickly. At 65,000 feet, there is not much air. Normally, that would cause someone to pass out in seconds. But if they turned on their air packs fast enough, they might have stayed awake for the whole fall. That means 2 minutes and 45 seconds of knowing they were falling. It means understanding they were going to die and feeling the terror of that descent. We do not know for sure, but the chance they were aware is one of the most disturbing parts of the story. Even though NASA kept many of these details away from the news to protect the families, the truth eventually started to come out through investigations and leaks. Warnings ignored. The Challenger disaster led to a massive investigation. President Ronald Reagan set up the Rogers Commission to find out what happened and why. They interviewed hundreds of people and looked at thousands of pages of notes. They looked at every piece of debris they found. What they discovered was very upsetting. The technical reason for the disaster was a rubber O-ring seal in the right rocket booster. It failed because it was too cold. O-rings are supposed to seal the joints between parts of the booster, so hot gas cannot get out. In the cold, the rubber gets stiff. The O-ring did not seal right. Hot gas got out and burned through the fuel tank. But the bigger reason was that the system failed. Engineers had warned that launching in the cold was a bad idea. They had data showing the O-rings did not work well when it was freezing. They told NASA not to launch if it was below 53 degrees. On the night before the launch, they had a meeting. The engineers told NASA to wait. But NASA managers pushed back. They asked the engineers to prove it was unsafe instead of making sure it was safe. That was a huge mistake. Under pressure, the management at the company that made the boosters ignored their own engineers and told NASA to go ahead. This was not just one bad choice. It was the result of years of ignoring small problems. NASA had been launching shuttles successfully, so each flight made them feel more confident. They started seeing risks as normal. The pressure to keep the schedule was very high. The shuttle was supposed to be like a commercial airplane, and delays were expensive. There was also pressure to get the Teacher in Space mission launched, so warnings were ignored. Risks were taken. And 7 people paid the price. The Rogers Commission report was very harsh. It blamed NASA's culture as much as the technical failure. The report made 9 suggestions to make things safer. All of them were put into place. The shuttle program stopped for 32 months. The boosters were redesigned with better seals and heaters. NASA's management was changed. New safety jobs were created. The culture shifted so that engineers could speak up without being afraid. In September of 1988, the Shuttle Discovery launched, and the program returned to flight. The crew carried a banner to honor the Challenger 7. The program went on for 23 more years until 2011. But the memory of Challenger never went away. The bodies of the crew were never shown to the public. After they were identified, they were given back to their families for private burials. 4 of them are at Arlington National Cemetery. 1 was cremated and buried in Hawaii. 1 was buried in South Carolina, and another in New Hampshire. Some of their personal items, like wedding rings and watches, were found and given back. The crew cabin was buried at sea in a secret spot. NASA did this so people would not try to find it as a souvenir. It was a way to let them rest in peace. Does knowing that the crew might have been conscious during the fall change your perspective on space safety today? Please share your thoughts below, like the video, and subscribe.